Thank you for joining me for OffSec Live, security tips for your devices and your digital lives. We can start with a quick introduction. My name is Christopher, or I said no cookies in Discord and Twitter. I'm involved in OffSec's internal security team, as well as infrastructure and SRE. But I'm also heavily engaged in software engineering, security research, and am quite involved in the community, either through local groups, conferences, or nonprofits. One reason why this topic is really exciting or interesting to me is it's one of the most asked about topics from like a security professional's point of view. Everyone from technical to non-technical people end up asking about how to protect yourself online. And I think it's something that pretty much all of us will be prompted with at some point in time. But the original kind of reason for this presentation is I had presented on YubiKeys and hardware authentication, and it seemed to be really advantageous for quite a few people. So I wanted to address some of these topics and then add quite a bit more about being secure online. Like I had mentioned, I'll probably jump around a little bit to include some additional topics. And I'm going to try to go back and forth between pretty high level stuff and somewhat technical. But the overall goal is just food for thought and to get people a little bit more conscious of some security concerns or ways that you can stay secure online. It is worth kind of pointing out, and it will bring this up a couple times during the presentation, is everyone's going to have different security requirements. There's really no one size fits all. Some of this stuff won't work for people. Some of it won't be enough. But it's really just going to be based on your own personal requirements and kind of what your risks are. So, yeah. So I think with pretty much every time we talk about being secure online, it's worth mentioning or asking ourselves what we're worried about. There's a lot of risks out there. There's a lot of things that could happen. There's social engineering, there's third-party exposures, there's things that we have complete control over, like password reuse. There's malware, poor data management. You can be targeted. You could be worried about already being breached. But we're going to try to split this up into kind of two categories, which is things that you can prevent and things that you can minimize the effects of. So typically we can prevent things like social engineering or reusing the same passwords. But on the flip side of that, there are things that we can minimize the effects of, like having a third party or a platform that you use getting breached. It's not necessarily something that we can stop, but we can do certain things to reduce the effects of it. So we're going to kind of go back and forth between those two ideas, and hopefully by the end we have some interesting takeaways for security. So the first topic that I wanted to kind of throw out there is kind of a shameless plug for passwords. It's one of the most common things that people will tell you to do in order to be secure, which is have good password management. I have on here, we'll start with standalone password managers. We'll kind of get to why I say standalone in a second. They don't have to be expensive. It's kind of one of the most important things because it allows you to use passwords, say, correctly. Most of us can't remember hundreds of passwords, hundreds of unique passwords. So we have to rely on password managers. Another thing that a lot of people will kind of take as a next step, if you're worried about password managers having kind of all the keys to the kingdom, is salting your credentials. So you store part of a credential in your password manager, a random part of it, and then you just know you memorize something that gets added to it, whether it's before, after, or within the credential. But mostly we want to look at long, somewhat random passwords. And random, we're going to use as an indicator of can't be guessed based on your personal information. But NIST, even NIST is now putting more emphasis and says the biggest factor for passwords is length. It's one of the most Important factors when we talk about things like people cracking passwords or guessing them, but length and it being unique. So we get into password reuse, which is bad. And we'll kind of go into why that's bad in a second. Another thing that a lot of people don't realize with password management is a lot of these tools have different ways of identifying if you've been breached. So for example, 1Password has something called Watchtower. There's also quite a few free products, some stuff like Have I Been Pwned or Dehashed can help you figure out if you've been breached. A lot of internet browsers can identify if a password's been breached. There's a lot of information in there that can be really advantageous from an attacker's point of view if you're going into a pen test or a red teaming engagement. Things like, I just found a good website called Illicit Services. It's kind of an open source or free data archive of leaked credentials and data. So there's a lot of stuff out there that can help you identify if you've had a credential breached, or if your next password is actually good. A lot of services, and it's kind of recommendation through NIST, is length and making sure you're not using an already existing or an already breached credential. So we have things like Have I Been Pwned being integrated into login forms or login processes. But I know a lot of people, especially those that are taking courses like the OSCP or going through OffSec classes, we become familiar with password cracking. And you can see off to the right of this slide, there's an incredible amount of companies that have had some sort of data breach. Interestingly enough, you can kind of see in the middle there, we have RockU. I recently actually learned that that's actually a company. For some reason, I thought it was just the name of a password list, but it was a company that did game development and had roughly 32 million accounts breached through like a 2009 breach. And now we use that. We use that whenever we crack hashed credentials. So from someone who's in that kind of field, we want to make sure that our credentials aren't in there. So ultimately, we want to make sure that we avoid using cracked credentials. We use long ones. Like I said, this doesn't have to be expensive. There's a lot of free services that you can use to manage credentials, like KeePass or Bitwarden, or there's a Linux tool or cross-platform tool called Pass, passwordstore.org. It's all free and you can self-host. That kind of brings back into what people are concerned about. If you're concerned about hosting your credentials on a cloud service, there's a lot of options for you to host it yourself. There's a lot of options to take a database and sync it manually. If you're not as concerned about cloud services or the data that you're storing isn't as valuable or sensitive, cloud services can be great for convenience. So ultimately, a lot of solutions out there. Budgetary restrictions are kind of no longer a concern when we talk about these password management systems. And it really comes down to identifying how complicated you need to make your management process to be secure for your threats. But one of the reasons why I had mentioned standalone password manager is kind of a rise of things like Stealer malware. I recently kind of did a deep dive on these types of malware, these families, and it was really interesting. These types of malware, they run on a victim's computer, they collect information about a system, they find various information, but they also target your browsers. I know a lot of people will use the built-in password managers in like Firefox or Chrome, and they get synced typically across like your Google account or whatever account's being used to log into that browser. But there's malware out there that will go through and it'll dump all of your saved passwords, your cookies, your browser history, any credit cards that were stored, any autofill data. Sometimes it'll search for things like cryptocurrency wallets or, chat tokens, Telegram data, VPN credentials. Well, it tries to package up all that data, and and it ships it back to whatever service it came from. So one of the initial access brokers, or can be used by attackers in secondary attacks. This was actually one of the precursors to the 2022 Uber hack. Started with Stealer malware and ended up with, a much bigger problem. And the other big one that this kind of popped into was the Linus Tech Tips YouTube got compromised because of this family of malware, this redline malware. But it's an interesting process that's becoming more and more popular. There's various, let's say, quote unquote flavors. This one's redline. It's another popular one. Raccoon's really popular. And the interesting part is you can go on to certain websites and you can purchase this malware for not that much money a month, $100 to a few $100s. So the widespread use of this kind of malware is becoming a bigger concern for people, and it warrants better password management and a deeper understanding of how things are stored within these various systems. This is also a really interesting type of malware because websites like VX Underground have really good samples and papers related to reverse engineering these applications or these strands of malware. And surprisingly, because they're sold from a service to people who want to leverage them for whatever reason, some of them aren't very obfuscated, and they kind of leave that to the reader. So they can be the original samples can be kind of fun to reverse engineer and pick apart if you can do it safely. But yeah, Stealer malware. And just to kind of show kind of what the Stealer malware can do very quickly. And everyone can kind of do this if they were interested in seeing what's saved in their browsers. But I just went online and I found a short application called Hack Browser Data. You download it, you run it on your local machine. It supports Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it just dumps everything in your Chrome, Edge, Brave, Opera, Firefox browsers. You can see in this output, it tries to find all the profiles and then just outputs data. Your history, your downloads, your local storage, your cookies, your extensions, your passwords, your bookmarks. You can see that it immediately throws out 3 credentials that had been stored within the local password manager. So this is one of the big concerns with using these built-in password managers in your browser. It's very convenient. The autofill can be great. And maybe you're not too concerned about what could be breached, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on, and it's definitely one reason why a lot of people are pushing standalone password managers. They typically have better processes, better encryption. They're stored separately to the browser. They're stored in memory. So it's kind of a fun experiment if anyone's interested in just seeing what's available on their local system, and it can be kind of a fun little tool to have in your back pocket if you ever have any reasons to use it. The other interesting thing here is it'll steal things like cookies or local storage. And that was one of the reasons why the Linus Tech Tips website was breached. It wasn't because they had poor password management or they weren't using MFA. It was because a session token was stolen. So we'll go through a lot of things about password management and MFA and different alternatives to securing your system, but it's not a cure-all. There's still ways that things can be compromised. So we'll just say you've had a bout with the malware or a password was compromised. So now what? Well, enter multi-factor authentication. Probably everyone is familiar with this at this point. Every site is kind of pushing it in some way, shape, or form. But it kind of breaks down into 3 different things: something something you have, and something you are. And multi-factor authentication just uses 2 or more factors to kind of prove your identity, or they become these evidence of who you are. When we go through a lot of password management, we're kind of talking about something that's your passwords, your PIN codes, your security questions, potentially even your usernames. You have something you have, so that's something that you physically have control of. like a security token or potentially even a phone. And then there's something you are, and this one, it's, more and more complicated as time goes on. They're finding different ways of indexing people. But the common ones are like face, fingerprint, voice, eye scans. Interestingly enough, they can even become behavioral. So how you walk can be used as a form of evidence for who you are, like your gait. Even potentially how you type. People have done interesting work on using the patterns that you use during typing, your kind of rhythm, to index you as a person. But it's important to also realize that, MFA is not social engineering proof. It doesn't help if sessions are stolen, or if you provide, we'll say like a one-time pass or a one-time code, or, there's various ways that this can be not as strong. But ultimately it can prevent it if one of the factors is compromised. So we have, like, if your password is compromised, you still have a secondary device or a secondary method that they would have to have before they compromise an account. If you lose your bank card, which is another example, they still need a PIN code typically. Or if you had like a VPN certificate stolen, you still need a username and password. So there's various ways of using this for your advantage. Like I said, there's a lot of weaknesses, but here we go. So MFA has weaknesses. It's a great step. Any MFA is better than no MFA. I added this little cartoon. Actually, it's one of my favorite. Kind of goes into, we'll call it rubber hose crypto analysis. A lot of people will have this kind of idea in their head that crypto is broken through these cracking systems, and in the real world, it's just stealing things or manipulating people and give you the right information. But in terms of purely technical vulnerabilities, you have things associated with SMS and email. Your emails can be compromised, SMS can be compromised. And a lot of times these aren't resistant to phishing. If anyone's ever had like a phishing campaign that integrated MFA, you'll notice how easy it is to prompt for a code and then just push that along to whatever site is associated with it. Even NIST states that SMS multi-factor authentication offers poor security. So people are getting away from SMS and moving towards other solutions. Biometrics is another one. It was kind of tagged as being one of the more secure versions, but what a lot of people don't realize is if your biometrics are stolen, you can't change them. So you can't change your fingerprints easily. Can't change the patterns of your eye. You can't change your facial recognition kind of profile. So there's problems if any of this data gets breached. At its core, it's still a series of it's still data that represents you. So some MFA doesn't even, you don't have to clone a fingerprint, for example, if you can access that kind of data directly through, what's ever after the fingerprint scanner. And then obviously you can be leveraged or taken if you rely on biometrics. This is also another reason why a lot of people, when they travel, they remove biometrics and they only use passcodes or passwords. So if they get taken, they can't, someone can't hold the phone up to their face or use their fingerprint. So biometrics, still great, still has weaknesses. And then we'll talk about something you have, like hardware keys or phones. And the big issue here, and the kind of the big reason why it can be not convenient, is it can be lost or stolen. And I'm going to put emphasis on lost because these devices can be pretty small. Like I have a small ring of keys, and this can be really easy to lose in a bag or out of your pocket or something. So you'll notice I had 3 keys, and I have quite a few more just as backups that have been added for this exact reason, things being lost. And again, the other weakness with something you have is, you can also be exploited. You can be, coerced into giving something up, or there can be theft involved. So I always like to talk that MFA has weaknesses because a lot of people will mention that it's kind of a cure-all to a lot of the vulnerabilities that we experience, or a lot of the compromises, but in reality, it's not as clear as MFA for the win. It's more of choose what works for your environment and know that it has weaknesses so you can mitigate them in some way, shape, or form. And it's kind of the underlying theme behind a lot of security awareness and being secure is understanding the underlying concepts around why things work or why things don't work, just so you can be aware of how to avoid those situations where they fail. So with the hardware keys, it's becoming more and more popular. They offer one of the highest levels of security for authentication. And this is typically because they rely heavily on asymmetric encryption. So public key pairs, or things that don't leave the device. Something like a password would be considered symmetrical. Both sides need to know enough information about the password to validate that you know what it is. When you get into hardware keys, you start using public and private key pairs, and no one but you, or specifically no one but this device, will have the private key. And that offers a significant advantage over things like passcodes or passwords. Typically what we interact with when we plug in a hardware key is something called WebAuthn. This is kind of a web authentication protocol used for accessing your hardware key and authenticating to a remote service. But it can be used for a lot of different things. For example, like PIV smart cards, it could handle RSA, ECC certs for authentication and authorization, or validation of who you are. And it comes in a lot of shapes and forms. You have things like the RSA key, where you have your one-time code that's time-based. You also have that top row, which are the YubiKeys. And even on the bottom right, you have a cryptocurrency hard wallet, which effectively will do the same thing as a lot of hardware keys, which is manage private keys. And a lot of cryptocurrency hard wallets will even offer some sort of like MFA capabilities, whether it's the FIDO or FIDO, or OAuth. So a lot of these devices do the same thing, and therefore they start to build these features into them. So you can have your Bitcoin wallet, and you can have your MFA mechanism. And then I threw on there Apple Passkeys as an honorable mention. A lot of people are starting to see these deployed. They can be super convenient, and it's still tied to your device. And it still comes down to managing private keys and authenticating to a service through a moderately secure way. To kind of bring it back to an example, we have an authentication process screenshot here. This is AWS, and it can be really simple. You log in, you put a password in, your username and password. You go to your two-step verification process, and it would ask you, how you'd like to authenticate. Two of the ways that it can, like AWS would support this, is like through your passkeys or a security key. You press security key, you press continue. You may have to tap your device. So your physical YubiKey has a button on it or a contact. You press that, it would do its authentication, and then you get access to your platform. So this is an example of a platform that offers this support, but it still has pros and cons. For example, it requires you to have a physical key. So if you don't have it with you, so you're on another system, or you left it at home as you went to the office, or whatever your situation is where you no longer have it with you, you're kind of out of luck. But it is very secure. And a lot of platforms like 1Password, for example, or even like your Apple iCloud account, they allow you to register multiple hardware keys. And this is a great habit to get into. which is you register multiple keys and you throw one in a safe, or you throw one in a place that is very secure. Some people even go as far as putting one in a bank, like in their safety deposit boxes. AWS is, unfortunately, they only allow you to have one single key. So this is one of those platforms that you have to weigh the convenience of this. If you lose it, are you kind of screwed, or are you part of an organization that may be able to reset that for you? But overall, it can be very convenient if you have it with you. And it's a great alternative if it's supported by the platform. It's becoming more and more popular. So I think as time goes on, more platforms will leverage, these integrations, but we're getting there. And the hardware keys can be used for quite a bit of other things. Like I said, hardware keys effectively just store private keys and secrets. So in a lot of cases, it can be used for applications that require private keys, like SSH or S-MIME for encrypting emails, or GPG or OpenPGP. They can be generated, the keys can be generated on the device or generated through like your local system and then moved to it. This can be a pretty deep talk in and of itself. There's a lot of nuances with how these can be used. I have an image there showing a validation of a Git commit can use hardware keys. And this is a great example of something that you can do to protect your code bases. One of the other risks that a lot of people will talk about is things like supply chain issues or software being compromised. And you'll see some people who engage in pretty high security development using YubiKeys to sign their commits. And what this effectively will do is anything that you see within a repository that's been verified, so you can kind of see it a little verified with the GPG key ID, is signed by that person with the assumption that they have their private key in hand. So it's another great way to kind of explore the use cases of hardware keys and start to kind of slowly integrate them into your lives. Hardware keys can be, I guess, depending on how paranoid you can be, there's a huge process there. Best case, your private key doesn't leave the device. So when we generate it on device, it's not as big of a deal, but for certain applications, you have to generate a key on your local machine and then push it to your device. And people will take this to a pretty, I don't want to say paranoid level, but a somewhat meticulous process of using air-gapped systems to make sure that the machine wasn't compromised previously, that there was no compromises in how keys are generated, or if the key is being pulled from the system with malware. Some people will use bootable USBs that are kind of immutable, so no persistent data. They'll generate the key, push it to a hardware key, and then not worry that that key was compromised. So some people take this pretty far in terms of managing their private keys, and rightfully so. If someone has your private key, this is no longer a secure form of authentication. So all that to say, hardware keys can be a great topic. It can be a great learning experience. You start to learn a little bit more about the intricacies of the encryption algorithms, how it works, how things are signed or encrypted. And they don't have to be expensive. I think if most people go to YubiKey, they kind of get some sticker shock, but there's a lot of deals around. There's other options. Cloudflare semi-recently did a deal where they were, fairly inexpensive to help Cloudflare push their zero trust solutions. That's another company that's trying to drive a lot of hardware key use cases. But it's a great little tool, and definitely something that if you're very security conscious or concerned about certain things, these can alleviate some of that risk. So we've kind of talked about passwords being really important. We've talked about MFA, some of the weaknesses. Kind of one of the next big topics that people bring up when you talk about being secure online or wherever you are is your devices and browsers. Again, this can be another complete discussion on its own. They become one of the bigger weaknesses in your, we'll say, within your life or your environment. This is typically one of the first points of contact if someone is trying to attack you, is either your browser through downloading something or browsing to websites, or in a worst case scenario, access to your device. And people take this pretty seriously. They can, again, go down a pretty deep rabbit hole of securing just devices and browsers. But I have some kind of high level tips here. For example, use passcodes or passwords on your devices. You want it to lock. It's just in case you leave it somewhere, someone steals it. It's not just open your system up and have access to everything. Depending on what your risks are or what you're concerned about, you potentially want to avoid some biometrics. Like I said, someone takes your phone and they also have access to you. Biometrics can be pretty weak in comparison to passcodes. You want to keep your devices updated. This is a really important one for both attackers and defenders. You want to watch for security patches. If you're concerned, make sure you push those to your device as soon as possible. If you're an attacker, it's also interesting to look for security patches because you know what's vulnerable. This is one of the reasons why we tell a lot of people to update as soon as you can, is because once a patch is released or a CV is released or a company identifies that there's a security patch for a vulnerability, people know to start looking to attack it. And this is one of the most important things about avoiding compromise through like malware. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the conference DEF CON. A lot of people will say, to not bring your devices, to kind of have this level of paranoia. And when it comes down to it, a lot of the best ways to protect yourself is just to keep your devices updated. Unless you're a really high value target, like a president or someone high up in the government or one of the kind of 3-level organizations, people aren't going to waste really expensive exploits on some random person. So one of the best ways you can avoid that is you just keep your devices updated. And that covers a lot of the risks out there. Another one is you want to know your settings. These phones are incredibly complex now. There's pages and pages of settings. Sometimes it's worth just kind of scrolling through and see what was added. What devices will share your privacy? What devices share your location, your microphone, have access to your photos? Some of these can default to a non-secure option, especially if it's a new feature. And we saw this a little bit with like advertising settings or things that would share a location. So sometimes it's nice just to go screen by screen within your phone settings or your computer settings and just say, hey, do I need this? Do I need to share information with this application? Was I aware that this application requested this data? And just do a little mini audit. And this can kind of go into know your apps and know your app privacy settings. And this has to do with devices, mobile applications, and browsers. Browsers specifically can be highly configurable, and they also know a lot about you, whether it's through marketing data or your browser history, passwords, secrets. There's a lot of information that it has that it can share with certain groups, whether it's to help them improve their application or their services, or to have more targeted marketing for you. So the same thing goes. Every once in a while, it's really nice to go through and just audit your browser settings. And this is where you'll also be able to address things like turning off your web browser password management, or turning off certain autofill features, making sure that maybe some of your settings don't get synced to the cloud. Like I said, depending on what you're concerned about or who you're trying to protect yourself against, this can be a great kind of process to go through. With our devices, you still want to look at like disk encryption and backing up data. Data backup can be really important if you lose it. And sometimes it can be a security concern. If you lose keys or you lose really important data, it can make your life much more difficult. So it's always nice to have the important data backed up somewhere. Disk encryption is obviously a good thing to have, just in case your device was stolen or someone got access to your device. One level up from your devices is typically where you're getting your internet. So your modem, your router, your Wi-Fi. This is also another really interesting thing that you can audit. This is your gateway to the internet. There's a couple things there, making sure that your modems or your routers are updated, that your Wi-Fi uses good passwords. A lot of people don't associate password management with their Wi-Fi, but you kind of want to make sure that you know what's on your wireless network, and kind of have that be a safe place. If you have a really terrible password, this could be potentially cracked. Very similarly to how passwords are cracked within, an online platform, with the hashes. So another food for thought, it's just something that a lot of people miss. They set it up once, maybe auto updates aren't turned on, or it came with a default password, or your admin panel still has a default password. It can be a really kind of easy thing just to do a quick check on and say, hey, are all of these features secure? The other thing a lot of people don't realize with like your modem or your local ISP is you want to protect your public IP address. And this is kind of where some of the VPN process comes in as a huge benefit, especially for people who do some sort of pen testing or red teaming, or even just learning about these processes or bug bounty programs. There's only so much malicious traffic you can push over your ISP before it can get noticed. Obviously, if it's through some sort of encrypted protocol like HTTPS, it's a little harder to index what you're doing. But if you're attacking a non-encrypted service or on a non-encrypted port, you're sending data or payloads, VPNs can help protect you from your ISP, maybe shutting off your internet. And plus, your public IP is typically something that you can track back to your location. So it's always good to kind of keep that hidden. And like I said, that's one of the good things about VPNs. VPNs are another topic that everyone talks about as being like, if you want to be secure, use a VPN. And I think it's worth considering VPNs for certain situations, but they're not going to help you with things like phishing attacks. They're not going to help you if you download malware. So there's a lot of attacks that VPNs do little to nothing for. But in terms of getting caught with like a man in the middle, or exposing your public IP, or being tracked online, VPNs can be a great option. Anytime you don't trust your network, VPNs can be a great solution. And then the last comment here is physical access will usually trump logical controls. A lot of people will ignore physical security in the scope of our cyber lives. And a lot of companies get kind of hit with interesting situations where someone gets access to a server physically instead of remotely. It's always worth considering how your devices are secured. And this can even be as simple as don't leave your devices in your car. Cars are easy to open, whether through destructive means of entry, covert entry. You don't typically want to rely on like a car, so don't leave it on your front seat. Same goes for your phone. Don't leave it at a coffee shop unprotected, like no passcode. If someone gets physical access to it, pretty much everything that you've done to secure your environment could be maybe not worthless, but significantly less effective. So a lot of stuff here. Like I said, this can be a completely its own discussion on its own. There's a lot of resources out there or like, for example, browser profiles that you can download, install, different device configurations, open source software. If you don't want to pay for things like AV or certain tools that can help you identify things on your system that may be dangerous. There's a website called inteltechniques.com by Michael Basil. If you ever want to go down a very deep rabbit hole on protecting your devices and browsers, it's a great resource. But most of this is just being aware of the settings and being aware of what risks are associated with those specific devices or browsers or applications. And the more you know about it, the more you can kind of gauge how at risk you are. So we've talked about a few different topics. So I wanted to kind of go back to the threats that we're potentially concerned about. So we talked about social engineering and how MFA can be a great defense for it. Random passwords can be a great defense for, we'll say, password guessing, whether through like some sort of cryptographic attack like hashcat, or social engineering as in someone being able to say, you know, what was your first dog's name, or where were you born, and using that in the credential. So password guessing in some way, shape, or form. Hardware keys can nearly eliminate a lot of this for a couple of reasons. Like I said, private keys typically never leave the device. And that process through like WebAuthn does a very strict validation of the domain that it's autofilling or pushing data to. And that's another good thing to point out about a lot of password managers is it won't autofill or present a credential if a domain name doesn't match. And this can be a great defense for phishing because it's just one more thing that points out you may not be on a website that you think you're on. A little deeper for I will call it the slightly more paranoid is I would always consider doing an OSINT investigation on yourself. It's always nice to know what's out there so that you can protect yourself against that. People know about it, so you probably should as well. And this can also lead to a process of kind of reducing your internet footprint. That's another topic that you could go down a pretty deep rabbit hole, and you have to balance between being known online and being invisible. Sometimes being invisible can be a big red flag for quite a few people. But it's always nice to know, what data is associated with you in breaches, or, how easy is it to find your address? How easy is it to find who your family members are? A lot of this can kind of lead you back to being more secure, more aware of social engineering threats. We talked about third-party exposures. A lot of this is just making sure that if one platform that you use gets breached, that not every platform you use gets breached. There's only so much we can do, for example, to prevent like Facebook from being compromised or another platform that you may use. But you don't want them to be able to use that information against you in other ways. And one example of this is credential reuse. If one platform gets compromised and it has a credential, you don't want that attacker to be able to turn around, find another platform that you're involved in, and get access to that. So unique credentials can help a lot with this, and MFA can help quite a bit as well. And then like the next layer of being more secure is trying to remove some of this data breach information. There's some services that will help you take down information. And a lot of this isn't even just third-party breaches. It can just be third parties sold your data for reasons. And there's a lot of information out there where you can kind of gauge what data was sold, what platforms are using it, how many data brokers are selling your data, and you can kind of go down that list and try to remove some of it. The alternative is if you can't remove it, play into it. And some people will even go as far as starting to pollute public data associated with their person. So next time you go sign up for an account, or someone asks you at the grocery store if you'd like to sign a petition, maybe don't put valid information, put a fake email, put a public address of a business or a library or a government place. So that when they inevitably sell your data, you start to kind of throw in some stuff that doesn't make sense. And this will reduce the value of the actual data that they have from 20 years ago. So like I said, this is another one of those things that people can be really paranoid about and go down a very deep rabbit hole as far as using different emails per platform, different phone numbers, VoIP numbers, to try to remove the ability to connect one account to another account, which a lot of people are really good at making those connections. A lot of platforms are good at making that connection. So lots of things you can do. Like I said, the underlying theme here is just be aware of it so that you know what risks are out there or what risks you have, and then address them accordingly. We have poor cyber practices. This kind of goes back into a little bit of the social engineering where, don't use password or don't reduce your password reuse. But you also want to look at where you're storing data. Avoid storing sensitive data on unencrypted formats. Don't make it easily accessible. Sometimes things don't belong in the cloud, and that can be something that you have to consider. Sometimes things need to be stored offline on an external drive or in an encrypted drive, or even an encrypted file on an encrypted drive. So depending on what you're storing, you can take different steps. This can sometimes just come back down to data loss. You store all of your data on your desktop, on your laptop that you take to everywhere with you. It may not be the best place for it, because if it gets lost, you're kind of not in a good spot. So taking kind of like a personal audit and saying, what data do I need in a case of an emergency? If my computer got thrown out a window, or in an absolute worst case scenario, you get caught in a flood or a fire, what is your loss? And that can play back into your online security. If you lose your keys, your passwords, sensitive records like your deed to your house or your birth certificate, they're not easy to get back. So finding ways to digitize, backup, and secure data can be a great thing to make yourself kind of in a better spot overall. And then one of the other big threats that everyone talks about, it's one of the most talked about things out there on the internet, is malware. We kind of went over standalone passwords can help reduce what malware has access to, but obviously if you have the right malware on your system and it has control of your system, you're not in a good spot. So always consider using things like antivirus, or like Mac OS has a fun app called Knock Knock, or there's like a system monitoring application that you can use that cross-checks processes to like VirusTotal. So there's a lot of free things out there that can help you mitigate what's running on your system. And people can take this one step further, and they can use like highly segmented and secure operating systems. Like one example is Cubes. It's like the Linux operating system that's heavily based around virtual machines. So everything you do is in a separate virtual machine or a segmented environment. People can do this with just regular virtual machines on, we'll say, their normal system. If you're doing something sketchy, run it in a virtual machine that's not attached to your network. But overall, you want to be careful what you click. You want to know where things come from. You want to have some way of validating that it's what you think it is, whether it's through hashes or downloading from a trusted source. And when in doubt, maybe just delete it or run it in an isolated environment. Maybe not on the system that stores all of your credentials and your life's data. And then obviously this gets back to keeping your software updated. A lot of OSs have built-in, not built-in, but a lot of operating systems have been patched for vulnerabilities that get leveraged by malware. So if you keep your system updated, sometimes the malware can be less effective. And then lastly, we just threw in like man-in-the-middle attacks. This is kind of it's a weird term to use in this context, but when someone is in between you and what you are trying to interact with, and this could be something like a phishing site kind of. It could also be if someone is able to redirect you to a website that they own, or if they're on your network. So this is when you get into things like hardware keys that explicitly validate the domains being used, that create a secure channel to a very well-known and trusted source. But you can also use things like VPNs, and be very careful with, what certs are being used on sites. So just some overview of things we can do. What it really comes down to is just knowing your risks and threats. If you can't answer who you're worried about, you're in a bad spot. Once you can define who you're worried about, who your threats are, who may be targeting you, if anyone is targeting you, you can take the necessary steps. It's kind of the one first question is people be like, hey, I want to be secure. And, the first question from a security professional should be secure from what? Because this can be a very expensive, time-consuming process. And if you don't prioritize your efforts, you can end up going down quite a rabbit hole. And another thing that it's really good to kind of comment on or to consider is, why you could be vulnerable. This is one of the good things about, we'll say, OffSec courses, is if you know how to attack a system, you know how to potentially protect against it or mitigate the risks associated with it. So like when we go through, why we don't use in-browser password managers, it's because we know how to attack it. So it always helps to kind of look at both sides, both the offensive and the defensive side when you're trying to protect yourself. Think about how you would attack you, what information you would find, what information you would leverage, where your weak spots are. And that can be a great place to start for being secure. Everyone needs to consider both your personal, we'll say, quote unquote, responsibility, as well as third-party and external platforms responsibilities. This gets back to, you're not going to stop Facebook from being hacked, but you can stop yourself from being heavily impacted by a third party. So break that up and kind of approach those differently. But overall, you really need to think about impact and cost. If you see something on your desktop, or you see something you do, or you're trying to protect, say, your house or your laptop, your phone, company data, whatever your situation is, just think to yourself, if this went missing or this was compromised, how would that affect me? If your answer is like, whoa, that would be absolutely terrible, maybe put a little bit more effort into protecting it. Maybe spend a little bit more money or resources on making sure that isn't a, this is terrible. Maybe it's it's not great, but it's not the end of the world. And then everyone needs to think about cost. And these two items are kind of one of the biggest things in security, which is gauging the impact of something and balancing kind of the cost effectiveness of protecting it. One of the examples that everyone uses, you don't want to protect, $100 device with $1,000 worth of security products. So you kind of want to spend the right amount of money for what you're protecting. And this can be tough. And one of the reasons why it's helpful to take a step back and consider impact and the cost to you if something is gone, because that gives you an idea of kind of capping what you should spend on protecting it. And if it's not worth it, or the impact is far greater than anything that you're willing to accept, there's always the ability to find other solutions. So avoid storing it in a certain place. Like, don't even worry about protecting it, just remove it. So always options, but ultimately you need to make sure that solutions work for you. And this is another big item that people fail to realize, is if you make a really complicated process and you personally bypass it out of convenience, or you stop using it, it could end up being a bigger risk than benefit. So make sure you don't over-engineer something that's going to make your life terribly inefficient or super annoying. Make sure that whatever you come up with works for you. And this can be a really interesting conversation, for example, with like password managers. Some people will recommend physical notebooks to put their credentials into. A lot of people scoff at that idea as it being like terribly insecure. But in reality, it's better than using the same password across everything. And for certain people, especially non-technical or some of the older generations, password managers just aren't convenient. They become very difficult to kind of manage for certain people. So what they end up doing is they don't use them, and it becomes a bigger risk because now they have data out there that they're not using, that they may have forgotten about, or it's out of date. So always consider what works for you or whoever you're trying to help, and don't push things onto people who may be negatively impacted. Like I said, security, there's really no one solution fits all, and we can talk about how important it is to use a specific device all day. But when it comes to it, if it doesn't work well or it's not convenient, people aren't going to use it. So impact cost and making sure that it actually works for you is very important. So that was a little rambling, and I didn't keep up with a lot of the questions. So I'll go back through some of the questions now. Early on, I don't know if this will be translated. That's a good question. If someone in the chat knows, that'd be awesome. What if you don't save passwords in browser? Can cookies expose this data? Sometimes there are situations where credentials or session tokens or different things can be exposed in a cookie, specifically session tokens. But platforms do weird things. They're all made by people, and people do potentially weird things. So it's not common for cookies to expose a plain text password, but I've absolutely seen it. KeePass is great. The fun thing about KeePass is there's actually a way of backing that up through like a Git server or through various things like Google Drive or some other cloud platforms, even platforms that you can self-host. And then you can actually leverage this on a mobile device. So a mobile device would sync with another server, download the KeePass database, and you can get some of the convenience of a cloud stored password manager. So KeePass is a great one. That's one of the other reasons I like Pass. It's a GPG based password manager for Linux, but they've kind of pushed that into becoming moderately convenient if you want to invest the time into hosting it, either on a cloud Git service or your local Git service, and then it can actually be synced across devices so that you get some of the conveniences of like autofill or having things available to you when you need them rather than just locked on a laptop somewhere. Yeah, Bitwarden's great. Like I said, depending on your risk, cloud-hosted password managers might be really scary, especially when we see things like the recent compromises with LastPass. There's definitely a hit to confidence on password managers. But for some people who manage that or have hardware keys protecting their online accounts, or maybe there's just not a lot of risk for you for those certain accounts, cloud-hosted password managers can be great. Saving passwords in Brave. It is a better browser. A lot of people say it's very good for protecting your privacy. Brave is still vulnerable to having your cookies, credentials, session tokens, browser history dumped. So although it's a better browser, it's still built on the same kind of foundation as the other browsers. It just has a little bit more privacy conscious outlook. So surprisingly enough, one of the browsers that's more secure that a lot of the tools that I looked up don't support is Safari, because it's its own beast. And typically credentials are stored in your keychain, not within the browser. So it leverages a lot of the kind of underlying security mechanisms of your keychain rather than the web browser. But things like Brave, Chromium-based things, and Firefox kind of suffer from this from this issue. A little comment about end of life. Yeah, end of life devices can be dangerous if they're no longer supported with updates. They can become vulnerable very quickly, and there's not much you can do about it other than rapid insecurity. So you end up putting firewalls or different devices in front of it, or you just assume that it's compromised and you deal with security mechanisms on the inside of the device. So, or on the inside of the environment. Let's see. There's a comment about the one-time passcodes. So TOTP is a time-based passcode, so it cycles based on your device's clock. And a lot of devices do support, or a lot of password managers do support this. You get into a little bit of a conversation on whether or not you want your MFA devices stored next to your credentials, but in a lot of cases, this is totally adequate for your situation. Some people will break it up, so they'll use a password manager for their passwords, and then they use other devices for MFA. So, for example, KeePass for passwords, or 1Password for passwords, and Google Authenticator, or the YubiKey Authenticator for your MFA. So splitting it up can be nice. iPhones have built-in MFA mechanisms for TOTP, and there's a lot of solutions out there. Depending on if you want them bound to your device or if you want them synced through the cloud is up to you. But lots of options. Sometimes it's worth just seeing if your device has it. Just Google, Android TOTP, see if there's a built-in one. I'm actually not sure about Android. And only recently, like this year, did I even know that Apple supported it natively within their keychain. So it's always nice to kind of keep up with what devices are, how they're progressing, what kind of updates they have, what features are being added, and see if that is a better solution for you in your life. Glass break accounts can be helpful. And you'll see this sometimes with, like, for example, AWS. You have your root account that they tell you never to use. So you create a secondary account that you use that's less privileged. This can be a great kind of thing to do if you have an account that you can add lesser privileged people for. Maybe use that for your day-to-day business, and then only if you really need it, throw in a root account or throw in your admin account and use that. The other interesting thing for this is sometimes it's worth having secondary accounts that a family member or someone really trusted has access to, just in case something happens to you. A lot of companies are doing certain features for protecting, I think the word they use is your legacy. iPhone has one, 1Password has one, where they can prove that they are a certain person and that things have happened to you and they get access to your stuff. Some people also put this information in trusts, if you're really taking it to that level. But overall, glass break accounts can be good. They can also be a little sketchy if you're not protecting them, or you're using another known account, or if you forget about it and you don't realize that it could be vulnerable to some sort of attack. Yep, the trusted member was mentioned by Queen 2099. So that's a great one. I think the presentation will be posted to YouTube, and will be available. Yep. What else? Someone asked if there's a good source for privacy and security tools. That's constantly changing. Like I said, Intel tools, Michael Basil has books that can take you pretty deep into privacy. I think that's one of the better resources that I've used. There's also quite a few people who are posting privacy topics. So sometimes it's just nice to follow privacy-minded people on Twitter, or start doing research on different privacy things. And you can find some really good resources. And I think that was it for comments. If anyone has anything else, we'll probably start to wrap up. I think I talked a little longer than I expected, but like I said, this can be a really deep topic, and it's not a simple one. Everyone has a different situation and can warrant different kind of security processes. So step one is just really figuring out what that process looks like for you, for your life. Yeah, the last comment is a really good call out. A lot of platforms will suggest an authenticator. So they'll have a button specifically for the Google Authenticator. This is just for convenience. They do use the same protocol. The two ways that you'll see a lot of people distributing the MFA or the one-time code mechanism is through a QR code. A lot of password managers have QR code readers. Your phone can have a QR code reader through the camera. But a lot of times there's also a button that says expose secret. You can push this into a lot of different apps and just use that if your QR code doesn't read it, or you don't want to give an app access to your camera, which is a concern for some people. The secrets for one-time codes or for your MFA setup can be an interesting one. Some password managers will store that secret, but they also sync it to the cloud, so it's convenient. If you're using an on-device thing and you're really concerned about losing that device or that MFA mechanism, you can also back up those codes. Some people, a lot of people don't recommend it because that is your that does represent your MFA device. So if you lose that or someone steals that, they effectively have your device. But if you're worried about, say your phone has all of your MFA and you're going somewhere and you don't want to lose everything and have to reset everything, or maybe that process is a nightmare, which it is, you can back those up. Or you can save the QR code. Like I said, approach that with a lot of caution. I think we're pretty much done with the questions. If anyone has any more questions, I'm sure the Discord people will jump in and answer any questions. It's a great topic to kick around with people and see what other people are doing. Like I said, this can be a really complicated environment to navigate. So it's always fun talking with other people, seeing what they do to secure their own systems or protect their data. So it's a great conversation topic for whatever group you're involved in. But thank you everyone for joining OffSec Live today. I appreciate it, and hopefully this was valuable for some people. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you everyone, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your Friday.